All right. Welcome to another deep dive
Yeah.
where we take the sources that you sent in
Mhm.
and we distill them down to their essence. Today, the topic is Amanta de Immanuel Kant, a text about the mind of Immanuel Kant.
Yeah, a real pivotal figure in philosophy,
Oh,
but
for sure.
it's not always the easiest to kind of wrap your head around.
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, when you think of dense philosophical prose, um, I think Kant is definitely up there
Yeah.
as a prime example.
Absolutely. And I
Okay.
think, we should just be upfront about it,
Yeah.
right? We're not going to make you a Kant scholar by the end of this.
No.
You're not going to be able to just go and, write a dissertation.
No.
But we do want to kind of give you the key takeaways, the things that really matter, why he's still so important to this day.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great goal. So we want to get to the heart of Kant without, having to trudge through all of the incredibly dense
Yes.
philosophical text.
That he produced. And of course, we can't talk about Kant without talking about the three critiques, right? Critique of pure reason, critique of practical reason, critique of judgment.
Yeah, those are really the cornerstones of his whole philosophical system.
What can we know?
Yeah.
What should we do?
Yeah,
And what is beautiful?
absolutely. And what's amazing is, even if you haven't read Kant, even if the name is just vaguely familiar, you've also certainly been impacted by his thinking.
Oh, yeah.
Because when you think of like ethics and political theory, aesthetics, epistemology.
Yeah, he's everywhere.
He's everywhere. He had a massive, massive influence.
Yeah. I think one of the most interesting things is that he really comes up with what they call his Copernican revolution, which is a fascinating comparison because, of course, in astronomy, Copernicus comes along.
Right.
And he suggests that the sun is actually at the center of the solar system.
Mhm.
Well, Kant comes along and he's like, hey, you know what? Our minds aren't just passive receivers of information,
Yeah.
but they actively shape our experience of reality. Right. You're not just a mirror, right, reflecting what's out there.
Yeah.
You are actively participating in the construction of the world that you see.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And to understand how he comes to this, it's worth talking about his life a little bit because he was famously a very structured, very isolated individual.
Right. I mean, he's almost, you think of him as this robotic routine.
Yes.
And Heine, the poet, had this great description of him as this kind of reclusive old bachelor in a quiet alley.
Right. Yeah.
So you think of him as like, really detached from the world and all the kind of crazy things happening around him.
Yeah, especially at the time. I mean, this was during some very tumultuous
Absolutely.
periods in Europe, a lot of wars and revolutions.
Right.
But he seemed to be completely removed from that.
But the thing is, like, while that description isn't false, it doesn't capture the whole picture, right?
Yeah.
It's not that he wasn't traveling and having these adventures.
Right.
It's that his adventures were of the mind, right?
Yes.
And the text makes this point, like, this lack of physical adventure actually masked a deep dedication to intellectual exploration.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's not that his life was dull. It's just that the excitement was all happening inside his head.
Exactly. It was all happening in his head. I mean, he had this strict routine, lectures, study, writing, but that wasn't a sign of boredom.
No.
That was like the training
Yes.
that allowed him to engage with these huge
Yes.
questions.
Absolutely. Like an athlete, right?
Right.
Like
Yeah.
they might be doing very repetitive exercises, but they're doing them to train themselves
Right.
for the actual event.
Exactly.
And his event was his mind
Absolutely.
and his intellectual pursuits.
And it's important to remember, as the text reminds us, like, he wasn't completely indifferent, right, to stuff happening around him.
Right, right.
I mean, he was in Königsberg, but he was aware of the wars and revolutions, and that actually informed a lot of his thinking.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's interesting that he was definitely influenced by the historical context in which he was living, and it makes you think about the Philosopher's Walk, the Calçada dos Filósofos, which is still a popular destination today.
I mean, it's almost like the perfect symbol, right?
Yeah.
This physical path that he walked every day that mirrors his kind of very, very dedicated and disciplined approach to philosophy.
Yes, absolutely. So now I want to circle back to this great paradox, right? This Heine points this out. You have Napoleon just wreaking havoc all across Europe, redrawing the map of the continent.
Right.
And then you have this this very, as Heine puts it, this very weak and somewhat invalid little man in Königsberg. And he's also redrawing a map, but he's redrawing the map of thought itself, the map of knowledge, the map of morality.
Exactly, exactly. And that comparison, I think, really drives home the power of ideas, right?
Yes.
I mean, Napoleon had armies, but Kant had his intellect, and that was just as powerful, if not more so.
Absolutely. And to that point, let's talk a little bit more about this Copernican revolution in philosophy. So what exactly did Kant propose that was so groundbreaking?
Well, he essentially said, look, our minds aren't just passive recipients of information. We're not just a blank slate or a mirror. We actually have these inborn categories and structures of understanding that shape how we see the world.
Right.
So the mind is actively organizing.
Right.
And making sense of the data it receives, not just reflecting it.
So in a way, we're creating our own reality.
In a way, yes. I mean, obviously, there's a world out there.
Right.
But we can only experience it
yes.
through the lens of our minds.
Absolutely. And the text gives us a really helpful example from ethics
Yeah.
to show how this might work.
Yeah.
So before Kant, a lot of people thought about morality as something that came from outside of us, right?
Right.
Like religious doctrine or societal norms.
Yeah, rules handed down from on high that you had to follow.
But Kant comes along and he's like, no. Morality comes from our own capacity for reason.
Right. It's about the autonomy of the individual.
Yes.
Your own capacity for rational thought and making decisions based on universal principles.
So it's not about following rules blindly.
Right.
It's about understanding those rules and choosing to follow them.
Exactly.
Because they make sense to you. Now, the text also has this really fun analogy about Kant being like this small shopkeeper.
Yeah.
And I love this analogy. So Heine says, he wanted to weigh coffee and sugar, but destiny willed that he weigh other things and even put a god on his scale.
Yeah. I mean, it's humorous, but it gets to the heart of what Kant was trying to do, right?
Absolutely.
This idea of balance. He was living in this time of huge intellectual shifts.
Yeah.
You had the legacy of the Renaissance and Reformation, the rise of modern science.
Right.
And he was trying to find a way to reconcile these different currents of thought.
Yeah.
Reason and experience, science and faith, freedom and morality.
He was looking for the balanso, as the text puts it.
Exactly. He was trying to find that equilibrium point where these seemingly opposed forces could coexist.
Yeah. And so, the analogy of the shopkeeper weighing things is just perfect because he was so meticulous about how he analyzed these different arguments.
And not just that, but how he defined his terms.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Like he was very, very rigorous about making sure that everybody was on the same page.
Yeah. Like, what do we really mean?
Exactly.
When we talk about these huge philosophical concepts.
Exactly.
And the text makes another interesting point, which I had never thought about this way. But it says that with Kant, modern science, quote, became conscious of itself for the first time.
Yeah, that's a really insightful point. It's not just that he was doing philosophy. It's that he was thinking about how we think about these things.
So he's not just analyzing the world. He is analyzing how we analyze the world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So he's asking, like, how does science work? What are its limits? What can it tell us? And what can it tell us?
Yeah, fascinating. And of course, that brings us to this idea of critique, which is central to his whole philosophy. And it's important to note that for Kant, critique isn't about just criticizing things.
No, not at all. It's not about just, tearing things down.
No.
It's about this very rigorous analysis of the possibilities and limits of human knowledge.
Yeah, what can we really know?
Exactly.
And how can we be sure we know it? And importantly, what can't we know?
Right. And the text draws a really helpful contrast between this Kantian idea of critique and, on the one hand, you have dogmatism, which is just blindly accepting things.
Right, yeah.
And then on the other hand, you have skepticism, which is saying, well, we can't know anything for sure.
Right.
Kant is saying, there's a middle ground here.
Right,
we can know things, but we have to be careful about how we go about knowing them.
Absolutely. And so his critique then becomes this real investigation into the very foundations of how we think about things.
The architecture of our minds, you could say.
Yeah, absolutely. So this shift in focus to this question of, how do we know what we know really had a huge impact on philosophy.
Oh, massive. I mean, it changed how people thought about the relationship between
Yes.
the knower and the known,
Yeah.
between us and the world.
Yeah, subject and object, reality,
Yeah.
and so on.
Huge, huge implications.
Yeah. And Kant was also, very observant about the intellectual progress of his time, or maybe the lack thereof in some areas. And he noticed that science seemed to be moving ahead at a very rapid pace.
Right, especially physics, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, they were making huge leaps forward.
But other areas seem to be kind of stuck, right? Like morality, theology. He's like, what
is this happening?
And I think that's what really motivated him to do his critical analysis of reason.
Yeah.
Because he wanted to figure out why is it that we're so good at understanding the physical world, but we're still struggling with these other questions.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, what is the nature of good and evil?
Right.
What does it mean to live a moral life? What is God?
Right.
These questions just seem to be kind of, stuck.
Yeah, not making the same kind of progress.
Yeah.
And so he thought that one of the problems was this, that human reason has this tendency to overreach.
Right.
To go beyond what we can actually experience and try to answer these questions that are ultimately unanswerable.
Yeah, like, we want to know those things.
Right.
But we just don't have the tools to actually know them.
And he called this, pure reason, right? When reason is just kind of operating without any constraints.
Without the critique.
Without the critique.
And that's what leads to these contradictions and paradoxes.
Right, which he called antinomies.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you get to these unsolvable problems because you're asking the wrong questions.
Yeah. So the critique of pure reason is his attempt to really scrutinize reason itself and put it on trial, I think is a good way to put it. How much can we trust our own reasoning abilities?
Yeah. And to do that, he makes this very careful distinction between what he calls phenomena and noumena.
Yeah, so phenomena being the world as it appears to us,
right,
and noumena being the world as it actually is.
Right, the things in themselves.
Yeah.
But his argument is we can only ever know phenomena.
Yeah.
The minute is always beyond our grasp.
And that critique, that idea of, examining reason and seeing its limits, that doesn't just apply to pure reason.
No. He extends it to practical reason.
Yeah.
Which is about morality, and then also to judgment, which is about aesthetics.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a big project.
Massive project.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the context, right? So Kant was living in a time when physics had made these incredible
advances.
Right. I mean, Galileo, Torricelli, these were like rock stars of science, and people were really excited about the potential.
They thought, the sky's the limit now.
Yeah. There was this sense of real optimism.
Right. This Enlightenment optimism that reason can solve all our problems.
Yeah. But Kant, as we've discussed, he was a little more skeptical.
Yeah.
He was like, whoa.
Hold on a second. Let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Yeah.
Because, yes, the scientific method works great for the natural world.
Yes.
But it doesn't necessarily apply to these bigger questions.
Yeah, these metaphysical questions about the nature of reality, the soul, God, freedom. These are things that you can't really observe.
You can't put them under a microscope.
No, you can't put God in a test tube. Right.
Exactly.
So he's saying, there are limits to what science can tell us. And that, again, is why the critique of pure reason is so important, because he's trying to figure out what are those limits? Where does science stop?
Right.
And where does something else begin?
And that's precisely where he argues that we can only know phenomena, the world as it appears to us, not the things in themselves, the noumena.
And it was this success of physics that really sparked a big debate in philosophy as well, right?
Oh, absolutely. This whole battle between the rationalists and the empiricists.
Yeah, so the rationalists were all about reason and logic, guys like Descartes.
Right, and they were really impressed by math.
Yes.
The clarity, the certainty of math.
Then they thought, well, maybe the whole universe is just like math.
Right. You can deduce all the truths of the universe from just a few basic principles.
Yeah. Just sit in your armchair and think really hard, and you can figure it all out.
Yeah. They thought that the physical world was ultimately structured according to these rational principles.
Yeah.
And so they really emphasized a priori knowledge that you don't get from experience.
Right. But then you had the empiricists on the other side, like Bacon and Locke, and they're saying, no, that's not how it works.
Right.
You can't just think your way to knowledge.
You got to get out there and observe.
Yeah.
You got to experiment.
Yeah. They thought that our minds were like blank slates. at birth, and that everything we know comes from experience. And they were really big on observation and inductive reasoning.
Right, drawing general conclusions from specific observations.
Yeah, and the text gives the example of Galileo, dropping stuff off the Leaning Tower.
Right.
He's not just sitting there thinking about gravity.
Right.
He's actually
going out and testing it.
Yeah, he's testing it.
Seeing how things actually behave.
Yeah.
Not just how he thinks they should behave.
And so these two schools of thought, the rationalists and the empiricists, were really...
They were at odds.
Yeah, they were at odds. And Kant, in his critique of pure reason, is trying to figure out, is there a way to bring them together?
Exactly.
Yeah.
He's trying to find a synthesis, a way to reconcile these seemingly opposed views.
Yeah. So, I mean, we talked about his Copernican revolution earlier.
Right.
He's not saying that the rationalists are totally wrong.
Right.
He's just saying that they're missing something.
Right.
And the empiricists are missing something as well.
Exactly. It's not just reason. It's not just experience. It's both.
Yeah.
It's this active interplay between the two.
Yeah. It's a synthesis. All right. So the text talks a little bit about Galileo and Descartes, how they kind of viewed the world. So Galileo really saw the world as this
mathematical structure.
Yeah.
Governed by precise laws.
Yeah.
And he thought that science was about uncovering those laws.
Yeah.
Expressing them in mathematical terms.
Yeah. And Descartes took this even further.
Right. Yeah. He was a real rationalist.
Yeah.
And he believed in the power of reason and deduction.
And he thought, in theory, we could figure out everything just by thinking hard enough.
He even suggested that maybe we don't need our senses at all.
Yeah, which is a little crazy, right?
Yeah, I mean, try navigating the world without your senses.
Yeah, good luck with that. But his followers, some of them took this even further.
Oh, yeah. They thought sensory perception was actually a kind of confused thought.
Yeah, as if our senses are somehow getting in the way of the purity of reason.
Yeah, like our senses are just muddying the waters.
Yeah. But the text points out, and I think rightly so, that this has its limits, right?
Absolutely. I mean, you can't just deduce everything from first principles.
No.
You got to get out there and observe.
You got to see how things actually work.
Right, exactly. The world is more complex than that.
Yeah. And so Kant comes along and he's like, hey, you guys are missing this key ingredient.
What do you both?
Yeah, you need both.
Reason and experience.
Yeah, the a priori and the a posteriori.
Exactly.
And he's like, they're not enemies. They're actually partners.
Right, two sides of the same coin.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about space and time now, because this is where things get...
where it gets really interesting.
Yeah, so the rationalists, they had their own ideas about space and time, and they tended to view them as these kind of absolute things, right?
Yeah, like these independent entities that exist outside of us.
Yeah, like containers for the things that are in the world.
Right, exactly.
So Descartes thought of space as being infinite and immobile.
Yeah, just this vast emptiness that everything exists in.
And Newton, he even went so far as to say that absolute space was the sensorium of God.
Right, the way God perceives the world.
Yeah, which is pretty wild.
Yeah, pretty heady concept.
Yeah. But Kant comes along and he's like, hey, guys, I think you're wrong about this.
Yeah, he had a very different view.
Yeah. He's like, space and time are not things out there. They're actually part of our minds.
They're forms of our intuition, he said.
Yeah. They're the way that we structure our experience of the world.
Yeah, they're the lens through which we see everything.
Yeah. And the text points out, think about it. Everything we experience happens in space and time.
Right. You can't have an experience that's not located somewhere.
Right.
And that doesn't happen at some time.
Yeah. You can't really conceive of anything that's outside of space and time.
Right. It's fundamental to how we perceive the world.
So Kant is saying that these are not independent things.
They're not things in themselves.
Yeah, they're part of our perceptual apparatus.
Exactly.
And he makes this really interesting point about these words like here and there and now and then, which are called deidics.
Yeah, words that depend on context for their meaning.
Yeah. So he's like, look, if space and time were absolute, then these words wouldn't have to change.
Right. They would have a fixed meaning.
Yeah, but they don't. Because our perspective on space and time is always changing.
Right.
Yeah. So that was a really, really interesting point. Now, this caused some problems for the rationalists, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because if they believed that space was absolute,
Right.
how could they explain the positions of things in space?
Right, exactly. I mean, if space is this fixed grid,
Yeah.
how do you figure out where things are on that grid?
Especially when you're talking about astronomy.
Right, especially when you're talking about the vast distances
Yeah.
between stars and planets.
Yeah. And so they came up with all these different ideas to try and explain this.
Yeah, I mean, Leibniz, for example, he had this whole thing about monads.
Yeah.
These kind of fundamental units of reality.
Yeah.
And he thought that the spatial relations between them
Right.
were pre-established.
Yeah, yeah.
Like a giant cosmic clock.
Yeah, yeah. But it's all a bit too convoluted.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting idea, but it doesn't really match up with our experience of the world.
No.
You know, we don't perceive the world as this giant pre-programmed clock.
Yeah, and so Kant's like, hey, I think I have a better solution.
Right.
Space is not this absolute thing. It's actually a form of our sensibility. It's how we structure our experience of the world.
And that actually makes a lot more sense.
Yeah.
When you think about how we actually perceive things.
Yeah. Okay, so Newton comes along, and he's famous for defending this idea of absolute space, right?
Right, yeah. He thought it was essential for his physics.
Yeah, to explain motion, acceleration, force,
Inertia, gravity.
Yeah, all these important concepts in physics. But this absolute space idea, it created some philosophical problems.
Yeah. I mean, for one thing, it contradicted our everyday experience.
Right.
Right? Like, we don't feel like we're moving through absolute space.
Yeah, we feel like we're moving relative to other things.
Exactly.
And also, it kind of implied that there was this privileged place in the universe.
Right, this absolute frame of reference.
Yeah, which is a bit weird, right?
Yeah, it's a bit unsettling.
Yeah. So Newton was aware of these problems, and he tried to kind of address them.
Yeah, he tried to explain that, well, even though we can't perceive absolute space directly, it's still necessary for his theory to work.
Right.
Right? It's like this underlying framework that makes everything else make sense.
Yeah, yeah. And this led to a big debate.
Oh, yeah, huge debate.
Between, people who believed in absolute space and people who believed in relational space.
Yeah, Kant comes along and he's like, okay, I think I can solve this.
Yeah.
With his idea of space as a form of our intuition.
Yeah, he's like, look, you're both right in a way, but you're also both wrong.
Right.
Space is not this absolute thing out there, but it's also not just relative.
Right.
It's how we structure our experience.
It's the framework that our minds impose on the world.
Yeah, yeah. All right, so now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the rise of empiricism during this time. So this was a really interesting period because you had all these different intellectual
currents.
Yeah. Different ways of thinking.
Yeah, and empiricism kind of emerged as this alternative to rationalism.
Right. Yeah. It was a reaction to the idea that we could figure out everything just by thinking.
Yeah.
So no, you got to pay attention to experience. Yeah, yeah. And John Locke is really the key figure here, right?
Yeah, he's considered the father of British empiricism.
Yeah. And he's famous for this idea of the tabula rasa, right?
Right. The blank slate.
Yeah. So he's saying that when we're born, our minds are like blank slates.
Yeah, there's no innate knowledge.
Yeah.
Everything we know comes from experience.
Yeah. Yeah. And this really resonated with a lot of people, especially those who were working in sciences like chemistry and biology.
Right, because those sciences were much more observational.
Yeah.
Less about mathematical deduction.
Yeah, they're about going out and observing the world, collecting data.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel